Before I start this video, everyone stop what you're doing right now and get yourself a friend like Dave. This brother is down to play any RPG at any time, no matter the time or effort it'll take to finish. Once again, he's answered the call to help me play through a game that I've had since a teenager and never bothered to try out, Final Fantasy 1. This time played as part of the Final Fantasy Origins collection on the original PlayStation. Funny enough, the first Final Fantasy game I ever played was the Final Fantasy Legend on Game Boy as a child. It was probably the first RPG I played as well, other than a handful of minutes of my cousin's copy of Dragon Warrior on NES. The reason we opted to play Final Fantasy in the Origins collection was simple. There are a variety of nearly game-breaking bugs on the original NES version. You can find an extensive list online, but to be short, a lot of things such as spells or character classes are simply broken. The Origins collection on PS1 fixed most of these issues, and to be honest, it looks great too. The story of the original Final Fantasy is pretty standard. The world functions off of 4 elemental crystals. They each have a problem, the world goes to shit, and it's up to your party of light warriors to go and set them all straight again. Mix in a little time travel plot somewhere in there, and that's that. One of the best things about Final Fantasy that sets it apart from other RPGs on the NES are the abundance of different classes that you can build your party out of. You can pick 4 of any combination, including multiples of the warrior, thief, red mage, white mage, black mage, and monk. Unfortunately, there is little to no actual balance between these classes. The warrior outshines basically everything, as both the unkillable tank and the main source of DPS in the game. They have no access to magic right away, so healing is a bit of an issue, as well as lacking all the other big endgame support skills. The thief sucks ass. They do like 2/3 the damage of the warrior with 2/3 of the HP pool. I believe the class gives you a better chance at fleeing from fights, but that's not a good enough reason to pick it. The red mage is overpowered. They have great damage in the early game, a good HP pool, decent tankiness, and access to all but like 2 spells in the game. They are basically the white mage on steroids, which brings us to the white mage. They're okay, but get replaced by literal items later in the game. They do crap damage, and you don't really need to use their healing spells all that much. The healing spells don't necessarily regenerate a good amount of HP overall either. Having a white mage on the team is kind of like playing with the handicap. The black mage is alright. They're apparently bugged to hell on the original NES version, but regardless of that, the spell system only allows you to use a handful of them until you have to rest in town. So like, if you want to zerg down a boss with strong elemental skills, that's cool, but that's about all they're good for. The rest of the time, they're literally worthless on your team. The monk is a buggy nightmare, and he's not the warrior, so don't bother unless you want to mess around with underpowered comps. During this playthrough, I went with a comp of warrior, thief, red mage, and white mage. In all honesty, if you want to just get through the game with minimal effort, stick with a 2 warrior, 2 red mage comp. There's nothing they can't do better than any other classes in the game. Much later in the game, each class can get upgraded, which raises their stats and junk, but doesn't necessarily make any of them better enough to justify having a crap comp until then. The spell system is a little weird. When you reach certain levels or promote classes, you'll earn new spell slots. You can fill these slots by buying spells from black or white mage spell shops in town. As far as I know, once you fill a slot, it's permanently set and cannot be swapped out with a different spell, so you have to be careful and plan out what you buy. The amount of spells you can cast are limited by how many slots you have available and the level of the spells in that tier. It's not as complicated as it sounds, but it does limit each character to just a handful of spell casts before they run out. It can make longer dungeons very painful later in the game. Due to the limited amount of healing spells you have at your disposal, you'll find yourself buying 99 potions to store in your inventory at all times once you can afford them. Final Fantasy is one of those games that casual RPG fans may not love. It can be incredibly grindy. Buying the proper gear and items to equip your party can be expensive, so you'll find yourself battling for golden levels at several times throughout the game. The rest is very traditional of many early RPGs. You go into towns, buy gear, talk to NPCs to advance the story, run around in overworld, explore dungeons, and fight bosses. There are blocked off sections throughout the early part of the game that can be unlocked using items you earn later on. You can unlock some pretty cool items by doing so keep a mental note for areas like this when you're playing. Final Fantasy really makes you want to explore every nook and cranny in each dungeon in order to find some of the best items in the game. You can find certain items that have on-use abilities such as strong magic or healing spells, and they are infinite use. Finding these healing versions of these special items is almost necessary to beat the game without spending hours of level grinding. These are items that basically obsolete the mage classes, as any class can use them at will. It would be a crime to not at least mention the music, which is up there with the best of the best that the original Nintendo had to offer. You'll find it impossible to not be humming these tunes for days on end. Also, to my surprise, the airship makes an appearance here, allowing for full open world exploration, which allows for some cool secrets breaking if that's your thing. The final dungeon of the game is a totally risky grind fest. It takes about an hour to get through with no save points or life or spell fill-ups the entire time. This is where the unused items are, in my opinion, 100% necessary. The dungeon is beyond difficult and riddled with dead ends, constant battles, and way too many treasure chests. You can find basically most, if not all, of the best weapons and armor in the game here if you want to spend the time doing so. Each level has what essentially amounts to a boss rush of the previous Crystal Fight bosses from earlier in the game. The end boss though can be quite the handful depending on your class composition. The trick to basically all boss fights is to use your support skills such as haste on your warrior and have them smash away at the bosses. The final boss though apparently has a skill that can refill its entire health bar. If you die here, it would be a soul-crushing defeat. Luckily, we didn't have to experience that. And that's just about all there is to the original Final Fantasy. It's a little rough around the edges, but overall very good. There is a lot of replay value here if you want to screw around with different party comps and make the game more difficult. I wouldn't recommend it for the casual fan of RPGs, but if you don't mind a little difficulty, random battles, and some grinding, I wholeheartedly recommend giving it a playthrough. I would stick to the Origins versions on the PS1 if you have it, just for the various bug fixes. But if you're sold on sticking with the NES version, make sure you check out a list of the game-breaking bugs beforehand. I'd give Final Fantasy 1, part of the PlayStation 1 Final Fantasy Origins collection, a solid 4.5 out of 5 stars. It would be an easy 5 for me if it were more balanced out in general.